if you're ready, you can start, or you want to wait a little bit.
No, I'm quite happy to start whenever you say.
Okay.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Paul, for inviting me to
Pleasure.
say a few words tonight, and to Frank as usual. Thank you very much, Frank. Frank and I meet on Shabbat in the morning, Shabbat morning in the Beit Knesset. So that otherwise we don't have a chance to talk. So there we are. So tonight I'd like to talk about Schmitta, and particularly about the Jewish geography of Schmitta. I was in the Beit Knesset on Shabbat, and I noticed something very interesting, which in fact is very relevant to the Shir this evening. So we'll start off with a very short Devar Torah on the Parashat HaShavua, Parashat Toldot, where we read that there was a famine in the land, and Hashem spoke to Yitzchak, and he said to him, don't go down to Egypt, right? Al tered Mitzrayma, shechon ba'aretz asher omar elecha. Stay in the land which I'm pointing out to you. So instead of leaving the land because of the famine, Yitzchak went to Gerar. And there, with Hashem's help, he succeeded in cultivating the land and had a great success. The Pasuk says, Vayizra Yitzchak ba'aretz, ahu vayimtza b'shana hahi mea sha'arim vayarechu Hashem. And he sowed the land and he reaped 100-fold. And he had a very successful year. Now, Rashi explains on the word ba'aretz hahi, something about the land. It says, Afal pi she'ena chashuva ke'eretz Yisrael atzma. Even though this land of Gerar is not as important as Eretz Yisrael, the full Eretz, the proper Eretz Yisrael. So you see from the Rashi that the word Gerar, the place Gerar, is not considered like Eretz Yisrael. But on the other hand, Gerar is still considered as being part of the promised land, because Hashem said, don't go to Chutz La'aretz, don't leave Israel, Eretz Yisrael, don't go to Egypt, stay in Eretz Yisrael. So Gerar has, on one hand, is considered as being part of Eretz Yisrael, and on the other hand, Rashi says it hasn't got the full status of Eretz Yisrael, being the land of the 7 nations. This is what Rashi says. So we see that Eretz Yisrael itself, there are different grades of land in Eretz Yisrael. Some parts have a different status to the other parts. And this, in fact, is the point we'll be talking about this evening. So this Devar Torah, which I found in the Parashat HaShavua, gives us a hint, a direction for our talk tonight. So the Schmitta is a special Jewish geography. And what does Schmitta have to do with geography? Well, this year, Tov Shin Pei Bet, is the Schmitta year in Israel. Now, Schmitta only applies to Eretz Yisrael. And for those of you living outside Eretz Yisrael, how can you share in the mitzvah of Schmitta? Well, I recall that when we came on Aliyah some many years ago, Schmitta was, before we came, Schmitta was something we had written in the Torah in Parashat Bahar and didn't have very much impact on our daily lives. But when we came to Israel 37 years ago in 1984, we were immediately exposed to the laws of Trumot and Ma'asrot. In English, it's called tithes. You have to give a portion to the Kohen, to the Levi. But then, okay, so we got used to that. And then 2 years later, in 1986, Tov Shim Mem Hey, we were exposed to a new experience, our first Schmitta. So I remember that very carefully because it was really quite a new experience. Now, Schmitta, which means the resting of the land in the 7th year, only applies to Eretz Yisrael. Other lands are not included because the Pasuk says, Ki tavo el ha'aretz, v'shavta ha'aretz Shabbat Lashem. It says, when you enter the land, then you have the mitzvah of the land should observe a Sabbath. This is the translation of the Pasuk in Vayikra Chafei in Parashat Bahar. So for those of us living here, it has a big impact on our lives. And I wanted to share some aspects of this with you on the geography of Schmitta. So the question is, where does Eretz Yisrael begin and end? What are the borders of Eretz Yisrael? Now, if we turn to the Torah, in fact, we see that in the Torah, two sets of borders are stated in the Torah. Now, the first border was given to Abraham in the Brit Bein HaBetarim. Brit Bein HaBetarim, when Abraham was promised the land, then occupied by 10 nations. And this is what the Pasuk says in Breshit in Parashat Lech Lecha. So I won't read the whole Pasuk to you, but what he says, in the English side anyway, is that on that day, Hashem made a covenant with Abraham, saying, to your offspring, I will assign this land. And he says, from the river of Egypt, it says, Minahar Mitzrayim, ad Nahar Hagadol Nahar Prat, all the way over to the great river, the river Euphrates. And then the Pasuk continues, the land of the Keni, Kenizi, Kadmoni, all the peoples who were living in the land at that time, Girgoshi, Vayavusi, 10 nations. So this land that was promised to Abraham was bordered by the river Euphrates in the northeast of the land, and by what's called, the Pasuk calls Nahar Mitzrayim in the southwest. Okay, so the various opinions, I mean, the river Euphrates is well known. There's no question about where that is. But the Nahar Mitzrayim, the Targum Yonasan calls it the river Nile. But other opinions, the more widely accepted, talks about the El Arish. El Arish is a river or a valley in the Sinai. And if you look at this map I've got down here, which I took from Dat Mikra, it's in Hebrew, but you've got the idea over here. On the one hand, you've got the river Nahar Prat over here, right in the northeastern side of Eretz Yisrael, of the map, and Nahar Mitzrayim, which is as I say, the El Arish, down here on the southern end. And here you see all the names of the nations who were then living there: the Amori, the Rephaim, the Kadmoni, the Kenizi. Shows approximately where they were living throughout the Eretz Yisrael that time. Excuse me. So that's the first pasuk which deals with the borders of Eretz Yisrael in the Torah, in Breshit, given to Abraham. Now, if we move to later on in the Torah, in Bamidbar, in Parashat Masei, this is towards the end of Moshe Rabbeinu's life. And Moshe Rabbeinu is about to tell them that you're going to go into Eretz Yisrael and you're going to conquer it. It's going to be under Yeshua's leadership. And this is what he says to them. He says, look, you shall dispossess all the inhabitants of the land. And the following is the land of Canaan, which you will have, and here are its borders. And then we have a long string of psukim right from Pasuk Gimel through Pasuk Yud Bet, describing all the different places which constitute the border of Eretz Yisrael. And I'm not going to go through it all, but you can see the pasuk says Gavul Negev. These parts are the southern border. These parts in these psukim are the Gavul Yam, the western border. And then you've got the Gavul Tzfafon, the northern border, and the Gavul Kedma, the eastern border. So you can see all these places mentioned in the psukim, they make up a border. Now, you can see that these borders are not exactly what was given to Abraham. It doesn't mention the Nahar Prat, the Euphrates at all, nor does it mention Nahal Mitzrayim, El Arish. It's not mentioned here at all. So these seem to be a different set of borders to those of Abraham. And furthermore, the borders province to Abraham were wider than those given by Moshe. So, number one, why are there two different sets of borders given in the Torah? The answer is these borders will apply at different times. The borders given to Avram refer to our long-term future, time of King David, who conquered many of the lands around, or in the far distant future, which are the ultimate borders of promised to Avram to include the lands of the 10 nations. However, the borders of what Moshe was talking about were of immediate effect for the Bnei Yisrael, the Jewish people, as they were going into Eretz Canaan, or Eretz Yisrael. So they were just about to conquer the land. As soon as Moshe died, and a short time later, they crossed the Jordan with Yoshua, and they began the conquest of Eretz Yisrael. And that was a conquest of 7 nations and not 10 nations. So you can see that's why in here it's talking, we have 2 separate borders, and the immediate one was the smaller border designated to Moshe and included the land of the 7 nations which Yehoshua was instructed to conquer. Now, why is it so important for the Torah to tell us what are the borders of Eretz Yisrael? Now, Rashi, on this pasuk we just quoted, says, Zot ha'aretz asher timpol lachem b'nachala eretz Canaan ligvuloteha. This is the land. Rashi adds here, Zot ha'aretz lefi sheharbe mitzvot nohagot ba'aretz. Many mitzvot apply within the land of Israel. Ve'ei nohagot b'chutz la'aretz, and they don't apply outside the land of Israel. Hutrach lichtov and so the borders had to be assigned and to be written down so we know where to apply these mitzvot. So there we are. So the borders were given not only to tell them where to conquer, but once the conquest had been achieved, these are the places where you have to keep the special mitzvot which apply to Eretz Yisrael. And here's a couple of maps I found which should describe these borders. 2 maps are not exactly the same, but look at the one on the right. It shows where each of the Shvatim took possession. Here we have on the Eveli Yarden, on the eastern side is Menashe, Gad, and Ruvain. And then working up from the south, we got Yehuda in the southern part of the country, with Shimon contained within Yehuda. Then we've got Dan and Binyamin and Ephraim, and Menashe, the second part of Menashe. And up here, we've got Yisachar, Zevulun, Asher, and Naphtali. So you can see that these are the lands which were conquered by Yehoshua. This is another map which gives slightly different borders, but you can see they're quite extensive. And here's, it's in Hebrew, but this says Damascus. So it's well inside the borders which were conquered. So it should be noted that the lands inhabited by the Jewish people changed during the course of time as they fought against the surrounding nations, bit by bit as Yehoshua conquered them, and then when Yehoshua died, they continued to conquer. And this continued up to the time of King David. And so the places where the borders would change, and the places where the laws of the land, the Trumot and Maasrot, the tithing and the Schmitta would apply, would change. And this is discussed in quite a number of commentaries. And a classic example is the Sefer called the Kaftov Vaferach, discusses this, but there are many other Sforim who discuss this as well. Now, I want to talk now about something which is called the land of the Olay Mitzrayim. Olay Mitzrayim means those who came across with Yehoshua, came from Egypt, and came into Eretz Yisrael. This is the expression used, Olay Mitzrayim, those who came from Egypt into Eretz Yisrael. Now, when they conquered the land, they sanctified the land. Hebrew is the Kiddush Haaretz, which means they began to observe the laws of Schmitta and Maasrot throughout the conquered land, and that is the land promised to Moshe. Now, in the Gemara, in the Talmud, this expression is used, Eretz Shechziku Olay Mitzrayim, the lands inhabited by those who came up from Egypt, the Olay Mitzrayim. Now, one important point is that the laws of the land would only apply when Bnei Israel were living in the land, okay? And furthermore, the Gemara in Megillah says, Kedusha Rishona Kitshal Lisha'ata Velo Kitshal Ated Labo. The initial consecration of Eretz Israel, that was the Kedusha Ta'aretz, would apply for its time only and did not sanctify the Eretz Israel forever. But once they were taken into exile, once Nebuchadnezzar came and destroyed the Beit HaMikdash, right? And then he took the Jewish people into exile, then the laws of the land would be cancelled. The Kedushat Haaretz would stop, as the original Kedusha was conditional on the Jewish people living in the land. So if that's what happened, then once we had the Churban HaBayit HaRishon, once the Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed the first Beit HaMikdash and taken everybody into exile, then there was no more Kedusha of the land. But we know that 70 years later, that the Jews returned to Eretz Israel with Ezra. And they were called the Olay Bavel. They came up to Eretz Israel from Bavel, as opposed to the first ones who came from Mitzrayim, from Egypt. They came from Babel, and that's they're called the Olay Bavel. Now, once the Olay Bavel returned with Ezra, again the laws of the land would apply, but only to the lands inhabited by the Olay Regel at that time. However, only part of the original land was occupied by the returnees. In other words, the land conquered by the Olay Bavel, or occupied by the Olay Bavel, was in fact smaller than the land occupied by the Olay Mitzrayim with Yehoshua. And there were large tracts of original land which were now occupied by the Gentiles. So when Ezra came back, he only managed to settle part of the original land, and the parts not settled were occupied by Gentiles. So new borders were established in which the laws of the land would be kept, and outside of these new borders, the laws did not apply. It should be noted that when Ezra returned, he once again sanctified the land, but this time on the basis of occupation rather than conquest. And this is discussed in the Rambam in this reference. And these borders also changed. Why? Because further lands were conquered, for example, by the Chashmonaim. So in a few weeks' time, it's going to be Chanukah, and we were celebrating the victories of the Chashmonaim kings. And they also conquered lands which were not previously occupied by the Jewish people at the time of Ezra. And so these borders expanded. And of course, then the laws of the land, the dinim of the Trumot and Masrot of Schmitta would now apply to these further new lands as well. So we'll go into some further details of the border of this reduced land of the returnees to the Olay Bavel, okay, at the time of the Talmud. But before we do this, we need to discuss just for a few moments some of the laws of the land of Israel. So just to get an idea of what we're talking about. Now, the laws of the land, the Schmittah and the Trumot and Masrot, the tithing, in fact, follow a 7-year cycle. Now, the first 6 years of the 7-year of the Shmittah, okay, the first is a 7-year cycle, and the first 6 years are not Shmittah. But what laws apply? The following laws apply: Truma, Maaser Rishon, Trumat Maaser, Maaser Sheni, and Maaser Ani. Very briefly, what are they? The Truma means you have to give a donation. The farmer has to give a donation from his produce to the Kohen, and it can be any amount he likes to give. After that, he has to give Maaser Rishon, another donation, this time to the Leviim. It's 10% of his produce. And Maaser Truma, the Levi has to give from the portion he gets 10% of that to the Kohanim. And the Maaser Sheni, which is taken by the farmer to to Yerushalayim is another 10%, and he did this on the first, second, and fourth and fifth years. And those 2 years, the third and the sixth year, where he didn't have Ma'aser Sheni, there was Ma'aser Oni. This is a donation by the farmer given to the poor. So these are the 5 different types of donations or tithes which have to be given on the produce. And the produce constitutes either fruit or grain or vegetables, anything that's edible that's grown in the land. And if you look at this diagram, which is taken from the book called Casualty of the Casualty of Food by Rav Moshe Vaya, is this very nice picture of, imagine a farmer, he's got 100 grapes. It's actually 100 plus a little bit, there's a little extra one here. And the colors here show how he gives it away. The brown ones are the truma. He gives off truma, and then he gives the green ones are the tithes, the 10% he gives to the Levi, the green ones, and the Levi of his 10 grapes, he gives one, the 10% of his 10%, in other words, overall 1%, he also gives to the Kohen. So the Kohen gets the brown ones, the Levi gets the green ones, and the red ones here over on the left are the Ma'aser Sheni and Ma'aser Oni, which have to be given on those special years. So that's how you can see how the produce of the farmer is distributed. And one or two other little points we have to bear in mind, that so produce still in the field, it can be eaten casually. If you go into an orchard and you take an apple, you can eat it. You don't have to take any truma or maasra because it's only a casual eating. On the other hand, once the produce has been gathered into the warehouse or the threshing floor, wherever it is, then it's forbidden to eat it until the tithes have been made, and that's called tevel. Tevel is produce which has not been tithed, and it's asur, it's forbidden to eat it. There's something else called demai, which is produce which you're uncertain whether it's been properly tithed or not. And it's called demai. And musar is what you've got. The produce has been fully tithed, and that's obviously fully permissible. So that in a nutshell is the dinim of trumot and masrot, which have to be kept in Eretz Yisrael. And these apply today as well. The other din, the other law which applies to Eretz Yisrael is the law of Schmitta. And of course, that's on the 7th year of the 7-year cycle. The 7th year is the Schmitta year. And that really affects two things. It affects the land, where there's a positive mitzvah haseh, to let the land rest, okay? V'shabbat shabbaton yeh la'aretz. In the 7th year, the land should have a complete rest, as it says in Parashat Bahar, and it should be a year of complete rest for the land. This is what the pasuk says. And on top of the mitzvah of the land, letting the land rest, are also 4 mitzvot lo ta'aseh, things which are forbidden to do. And what are they? The pasuk continues. It says you're not allowed to sow your field, prune your vineyard. You're not allowed to reap the growth of your harvest, or gather in the fruit, the grapes of your entry. So you can see these are the mitzvot of Schmitta which apply just to the land itself. And as far as the produce is concerned, the produce also has restrictions. It's got kedushat Schmitta. It's got, so the fruit and the grain or vegetable they're growing, it has to be made ownerless. You're not allowed to own anything. You have to make it freely accessible for the fruit to be accessed by anybody, any person, or even by animals as well. You have to abandon the ownership. It has to be hefker. The second thing is that when you do eat the fruit, you have to take special care with it. It can only be eaten in the normal way, and you can't do business with it. You're not allowed to buy it or sell it. You're not allowed to throw it away in a disrespectful way. It has to be disposed of in a special way. And the third and very important thing is the thing called biur. Biur means that once the produce is no longer available in the field, okay? Let's say I've got a tree full of grapes, and the grapes are on the tree, and anybody can come in and take the grapes. However, once the grapes have been finished in the field, in the orchard, and I have grapes stored in my home, then there is the time of biur. Biur means the time when when the fruit is no longer available in the field. And then anything I have stored in my home, I have to get rid of it. I have to remove it from the storage. I have to make it ownless and make it freely accessible for anybody who wishes to take and eat it. So that's called the Zaman Biur, the time of Biur. And after that time, I'm not allowed to eat it if I put it in the house. And the final point is that during the 7th year, when the Schmittah, the dinim of Trumot and Masrot do not apply. Okay, the Trumot and Masrot only apply for 6 years, and the 7th year, only Schmittah applies. Now, okay, having given you that very brief summary of some of the dinim which apply to Eretz Yisrael, I now want to come back to our main subject, which is the borders of Eretz Yisrael, in particular in the times of Chazal. Now, the details of the laws of the land, of Trumot and Maasrot and Schmitta, are laid down in the Talmud in the Seder Zeroim. You know, the Mishnayot have six Sedarim, Shisha Sidrei Mishnah, and the first Seder is called Zeroim. Zeroim means seeds. It means anything to do with agriculture. And the source of these dinim can be found in the Mishnah and also in the Talmud Yerushalmi. Now you might ask, why in the Talmud Yerushalmi? What happened to the Talmud Bavli? Because there is no Talmud Bavli on Seder Zeroim. It's quite remarkable. There's Talmud Bavli on most of the other parts of the Mishnayot, but there's nothing on Zeroim except Brachot, which is the first one. But after that, there's nothing on any of the other. Demai is one of the Masechtot, and Shvi'it and Challah. All these, there's no Talmud Bavli. There's only Talmud Yerushalmi. Okay, so the Talmud provides directives and in addition to providing the dinim we've just been discussing a moment ago, it also tells us to places where these laws apply and do not apply. And this obviously is going to help us in our geography, in finding the borders of Eretz Yisrael. Now, one of the main sources of information about where these dinim of Eretz Yisrael apply is in a Mishnah. It's called the Mishnah of the Three Lands, Shalosh Aratzot. It's in the Mishnah of Shvi'it, Perek Vav, Mishnah Aleph. And this is what this Mishnah says. Shalosh Aratzot l'Shvi'it. Eretz Yisrael is divided into 3 territories regarding Shvi'it, regarding the dinim of Schmitta. 3 different territories, 3 different sets of land. The produce from the land which was occupied by the Olay Bavel, that is, those who returned from Bavel with Ezra, the land that they occupied, that goes from Eretz Yisrael as far north as a place called Chaziv. Today in modern Israel it's called Achziv. It's up on the northern, it's on the Mediterranean coast. It's an ancient town. There are only ruins of it left now, but it's north of Haifa, north of Akko, and it's a place called Achziv. So it's saying to us that the Olay Bavel occupied the territory up to as far north as Achziv, and the din is any produce from those lands may not be eaten after the time of Biur, and the land may not be cultivated. Secondly, the Mishnah says there was another area of land which was occupied by the Olay Mitzrayim, those who came up with Yehoshua and conquered the land. And that goes from Achziv further up to the river, or something is called the river. It doesn't say which river, it's called the river, and to another place called Amona. Now, any fruit and produce in that land may be eaten after the time of Biur. In other words, there aren't any restrictions on the fruit and the produce, but the land may not be cultivated. And there's a third area, and that is from the river, the so-called river, we'll discuss it in a moment where it is, but the river and onwards, the produce may be eaten after the time of beer, and the land may be cultivated. So we can see that this Mishnah gives us three geographical areas, according to whether it was occupied by Olay Bavel or Olay Mitzrayim. And each area has its own set of Schmitta laws. The full set of Schmitta laws, the most restrictive ones, apply to the area south of Achziv. And the laws apply to both the land and the produce. And this area is considered as Eretz Israel proper. This is the full Eretz Israel. A more restricted set of Shmitta laws applies north of Achziv and south of the river and Armona. And the laws apply to the land, but not to the produce. So we can see this area has a special status with only some of the aspects of Schmitta applying. And finally, there's from the north, the river, the so-called the river and Arnon onwards. We're talking about areas north of Israel and today in Lebanon, where no Schmitta laws apply. And this is considered as Chutz La'aretz, outside of Eretz Israel completely. So these are the three areas specified in this Mishnah. So the purpose of the intermediary area, where you've got Eretz Israel proper, you've got Chutz La'aretz, and you've got this intermediate area, which is, it doesn't apply, Schmitta doesn't apply to fruit, but it does apply to the land. You can't work the land. So the purpose of this intermediate area was to act as a reminder that these external lands were originally part of the greater Eretz Israel occupied by the Olay Mitzrayim. And that is why certain restrictions were instituted to produce grown in those areas. In other words, in those areas, the land is still restricted. If a Jew were to buy land in those areas, he wouldn't be allowed to work the land. But any fruit growing in that area would not have any restrictions of Shmitta. Now, let's just come on to try and identify these areas. It's generally regarded that the river from Achziv, by the way, I'll show you in a moment, here's a map of Achziv. Okay, this map here shows Achziv. It's on the coast, north of Akko. The places you might well recognize are Caesarea, which is an ancient city. Akko,
for people who would like to know, it's just below Rosh HaNikra, which is the border with...
Right, just below Rosh HaNikra. Correct, thank you, Frank. So Achziv, this is the border. This is today's border with Lebanon. And this is Rosh HaNikra, just here. And Achziv is just a few kilometers south of the border. And there's nobody living there now, but it's an area called Achziv, and there are some ruins of an ancient city that used to be there. If we look further up the coast in Lebanon today, we have Tyre, which in Eretz Israel called Tzur, and that was part of the original Eretz Israel. And if we look at a few other places further eastwards, we're going to talk about Bet Sha'an. Bet Sha'an is over here, right? And here you have Tiberias, which you recognize, and other parts of the Galil further north. Okay, so this shows you where Achziv is. So south of Achziv is Eretz Israel proper. North of Achziv, up into this place to the river, wherever the river is, and I'll show you in a moment where the river is. The river is actually here. You can see a river. Up to there was occupied by the Olay Mitzrayim, but not the Olay Bavel. And therefore, in these areas, you can't work the land, but the fruit has no restrictions of Shmitta. And I have another map here, which is more of a map of Lebanon, which actually shows a river Litani. And this is considered to be the river referred to in the Mishnah. And you can see it right this stage, this path, it runs east-west along here. and comes out into the Mediterranean just above Tyre. So this is what's referred to. So from Achziv, I go back to this map, from Achziv northward to the Litani, this is the Litani here, not marked, but this is the Litani River, is over here would be the area occupied by the Olay Mitzrayim, but not by the Olay Bavel. Now, so that Mishnah we've just looked at, a very interesting Mishnah, is one source of information about the geography of Eretz Yisrael and the borders. Another one, and there are many others, but one of the most important ones is in the Talmud Yerushalmi itself, where the land of the Olay Bavel is defined. And this is the Talmud Yerushalmi on Shvi'it Perek Vav, the sixth Perek, the first halacha. And there it says, Techume Eretz Yisrael kol shechziku Olay Bavel. These are the borders of Eretz Yisrael as inhabited by the Olay Bavel, and this is those. And here you have a long list of towns and places in Eretz Yisrael, and these places were all on the border of Eretz Yisrael for the Olay Bavel. Now, I'm not going to go into detail, first of all, because many of these places I've never heard of, and they are known, most of them are known where they are. I'm just going to pick out a couple here. This one is Akko, so Akko is on the border, and this one down here is Ashkelon, as you know, is just a border, it's in the news, unfortunately, a lot in the last year or two. It's just north of Gaza. So that's two places. So they were actually on the border. It's not actually Ashkelon, but Genia, the Gan Ashkelon, which means the surrounding districts of Ashkelon. Ashkelon itself was not actually part of Eretz Yisrael at that time, but the surrounding areas were. Okay, so this is a second source of information. As I say, I'm not going to go into detail on all these places, but it shows you that the Talmud itself, either the Mishnayot or the Talmud Yerushalmi, give us quite a lot of detail. And there are many other sources within the Yerushalmi which tell us about places, whether they were affected by Shvi'at or not. And in fact, this list, or a list very similar to it, is found in the Sifri. That's also the Sifri on the Torah. And in the Tosefta Shvi'at, there's another list very similar, almost the same, but not exactly the same. There are slight differences between them. Now, I want to tell you something quite interesting. It should be noted that the Talmud Yerushalmi was finalized in the 4th century. And that was the source of information about this geography. Until very recently, until the discovery in the 1970s, some 40 years ago. And I'm now going to talk to you about the Mosaic of Rehab. Kibbutz Ein HaNatziv is a religious kibbutz situated south of Beit Shan in the Arava Valley, along which runs the River Jordan, running southwards from the Kinneret to the Dead Sea. Nearby this kibbutz is an ancient settlement called Rehab, which had a Jewish population, so the archaeologists tell us, from the time of the first temple.
Sorry, Beit Shan is not in the Arava Valley, but in the Emek Beit Shan, the Beit Shan Valley.
Yeah, correct. But the kibbutz is in the Arava. Okay, but anyway, Frank, let's leave that argument between us. We'll talk about it later. Now, but let me continue the story. The story is in 1973, farmers working on Kibbutz Ein HaNatziv came across the remains of an ancient building and called in the Israel Antiquities Authority to investigate. These are the people who do all the investigations into anything which is found for archaeological finds. And the archaeologists discovered that this was the remains of an early synagogue, Beit Knesset. The investigations revealed that the Beit Knesset was first built in the 4th century of the Common Era. It was approximately the year 350, at the time of the writing of the Talmud Yerushalmi. The building was destroyed. This Beit Knesset they found it would be destroyed and then rebuilt, and underwent extensive enhancements. Now, it should be noticed that ancient Bate Knesset, ancient synagogues, can be found in the Galilee in many places, as shown in this map. This is a map. All the places marked on here are old Bate Knesset, which have been found, and you can visit, most of them can be visited today, and you'll find some archaeological remains, and you can see all these places in the Galil, around the Kinneret. Some of them are in the Golan, where are places where there were Bate Knesset. Maybe you may have visited sometimes on your visit to Israel. This place, Rehov, is actually shown here. This is the River Jordan here, the Arava Valley, and Rehov, this ancient city, is marked down here. Beit Shan, the city of Beit Shan, you can see, is also marked here, just off the River Jordan. Now, why am I telling you all this? By the way, this is an example of a Beit Knesset in a place called Arbel. Arbel is just above Tiberia, above Tiberias. There's a picture of an old synagogue. There's a few columns left, and you see, you can go visit it. It's open to the public. Now, this synagogue in Rehov, however, was different from all the other synagogues that have been found in one particular respect. It was discovered that on the pillars which supported the ceiling of the synagogue were written dedications in Hebrew and in Aramaic, and also texts dealing with the halachot of Schmittah and the tithes, the Trumot and Maasrot. These pillars had been plastered over at a later date, but in a later enhancement to the Beit Knesset, an entrance hall was added, and a mosaic floor with this text was laid on the floor of the entrance to the Beit Knesset. This mosaic floor was found almost intact by the workers, by the farmers on the kibbutz Ein Hatziv. And this is a picture of the mosaic as it was found. It's a large mosaic. It's 4.3 meters long and 2.75 meters breadth. And you can see here. And you can see here there's writing on it, as we can see. What is this writing? It's the most extensive mosaic text. And the text is actually here, is in 19 lines. And they've deciphered it. And below here in the colored script is in fact the text itself, which is 19 lines long. I'll show you to the end of it and I'll come back up. You see, up to 19 lines. And we're interested to know what it said. And here I've taken the top bit of the text, the top corner of the text. I've blown it up a little bit, and you can actually read. So that if I read here, what the deciphered form of is, it says, Shalom, haperot halalu asurim bebeit sha'an bashviyit. The following fruit these fruits are forbidden in Beit Sha'an bashviyit, on the 7th years, uvashar shavua, and on the other years of the 7th, mit asrim demai. They have to be taken, Maisa has to be taken, because the fruit is considered as demai, with doubt whether it's been tithed or not. If I look at these words, the first words here, shalom, haperot halalu asurim bebeit sha'an bashviyit. If you look very carefully, you can see what's written here. Shalom, haperot halalu asurim bebeit sha'an bashviyit. So it's quite legible, especially get used to the writing. You can see the mosaic, you can see the small stones which make up the mosaic, and that's how the writing was made over 1,500 years ago in this synagogue, this Beit Sha'an. So what about the text here? What is actually written here? Well, these texts contain halachot for the land of Israel, including Schmitta and tithes, specifying for different locations around Eretz Israel. And this is what they found only 40 years ago. So they found that the mosaic, if you break down the 19 lines, covers 4 different sections. The first section, which is lines 1 to 9 of the Mosaic, deals with the Beit Sha'an and lists the produce available in the surrounding towns. So here I've just broken it down. This is the first sentence. Here we have a list of fruits and vegetables, kishuim, abatifim, etc. And then we have not only Beit Shan, but the towns surrounding Beit Shan, to the Darom, to the south, to the west, to the Tzafon, the north, and the east, about these towns as well, where the fruit there is permissible on Shvi'it. And that's what it says. This is the translation in the black and white. It's a translation. You can see these fruits are forbidden in Beit Shan during the 7th year, and the other years of the 7-year cycle, they are to be tithed. They have to pay truma to mice as demai. And here's the list: cucumbers, watermelons, all these parsnips, all different types of fruits, wine, oil, olive oil. And then the 7th year, Schmitta applies, and the other years, they have to be tied to demai. And for any bread coming from this area, which is the corn grown in this area, challah has to be taken. And then it says, these are the places that are permitted in the vicinity of Beit Sha'an, to the south, from this place, the west, this place, north, this place, and the east, this place. And that's the first section. So what's important here is that Beit Shan and some of the towns which follow, referred to here, in fact, were Gentile towns. They weren't occupied by Jews. They were occupied by Gentiles, non-Jews. And the Mosaic is indicating that any Jew going into such a city and buying produce there, he can't assume that this produce is free of the laws of Schmitta. Why? Because produce, fruit and vegetables, could easily have been imported into these towns from the Jewish farmers in the surrounding districts. And if that's the case, they would be restricted because of the laws of Schmitta and Trumot and Masrot. So that's why we can see that in Beit Shan, in the 7th year, the fruit has Kedushat Shvi'it, because maybe it's imported, and it has to be treated accordingly. And therefore, after the time of Biur, in other words, the time when it's finished in the field, it's forbidden to eat it if it's stored. And that's what it means. When the text says the 7th year, the Schmitta, the 7th year, the Schmitta laws apply. And similarly, for the other 6 years, the produce would be demai. If you bought anything from the market in Beit Shan, you have to assume there's a reasonable doubt and certainty whether this came from a Jewish farmer who sold his produce to the dealer, to the fruit seller in the market, and it could be Jewish produce, and therefore you have to take demai, you have to take truma to maisrut on it. So that's the first section. The second section, lines 9 to 13, the Mosaic, deal with towns were called, following towns: Susita, Naveh, and Tyre. Now, Susita is in the Golan, 2 kilometers east of the Kinneret. It's an old ancient city. Again, you can visit the ruins that are available to be visited. Naveh is also on the Golan, but further inwards. Today, it's actually in Syria. It's over the border. And the third town being discussed here is Tyre, or Tzur, on the Mediterranean coast, we saw today in Lebanon. And we can see here, it says, it gives you a list of Susita, that's the first town, Naveh is the second town, and the third town here. And it tells you about the produce, what produce is available. So here we go. The translation is: the towns that are prohibited in the region of Susita are as follows. These are small, presumably villages surrounding Susita, and the fruit from that part is prohibited. Why? For the same reason we said before, because though the neighboring districts were Jewish districts, and it could well be that fruit was imported to Susita from those Jewish surrounding districts and farmed by Jewish farmers, and therefore subject to the laws of Susita. And therefore, Naveh is also, and Tyre is also further north, is also we're in doubt and the towns around Tyre, again, the fruit there would be prohibited during the season of Shmittah. Okay. Now, the third section is very important. The third section of the Mosaic is, in fact, a very similar list of what we've seen above. It's a list of Techume Eretz Yisrael, Makom Sheha Echziku Olay Bavel, the boundaries of the land of Israel, which were held by the Olay Bavel. And lo and behold, we have another list there of the towns which constitute the borders of Eretz Yisrael. And we've just seen that above, right? We've just seen this above when we saw the Bavli, the Yerushalmi, which also has a list. This list is very, very similar. And most of the places on this list are mentioned in the Bavli, in the Yerushalmi, and are identical. Not all of them, but most of them. Now, we can recognize some of the names of here. We can recognize Ashkelon, and we can recognize Caesarea, and Dor, it's an ancient town just north of Caesarea, and Akko. So we can see that this border goes up the Mediterranean coast from Ashkelon in the south, through Caesarea, Dor, and to Akko in the north. And then the border goes across, it goes through to a place called Panias. Panias is on there. Panias is those of you, Frank will certainly know Banias. You know, the Banias, that's Panias, the source of the river Jordan, and that's towards the east, to the top of the river Jordan. And then the border goes down southwards.
Panias is Greek. Greeks call it Panias. Yeah, we call it Panias.
We call it Panias. It comes from the Greek god Pan. That's what we call Panias. Anyway, another place on the border was Basrat, which today is in Iraq. And mentioned also there is Heshbon, which is mentioned in the Torah as the capital of Sichon Melech Amori, is in Sefer Devarim, Sefer Bamidbar rather, and Nachal Zered is also mentioned in the Torah. Both of these on the east side of the River Jordan. So you can see that this list gives a comprehensive thing of.
Panias is from the Romans, and it's like some Avodat Elilim there.
That's right. The god Pan.
Pagani, yeah.
Exactly. And the final section is the last section of the Mosaic, deals with the towns around this place, Panias, right? And the towns around Caesarea and Sebastian. And here goes these are the fruits that are prohibited in Panias in the sabbatical year, okay? But the remaining 7-year tithe, they have to be 7 years, they have to be tithed, and it gives you the produce, rice, walnut, sesame, etc. And then it goes to Caesarea. And these places, if you buy anything in Caesarea, which is Caesarea again is another non-Jewish town, but if you went into the market to buy produce in that town, you can assume that these items came from Jewish sources and therefore had to have demai, had to be tithed. And Sebaste is Samaria, in the middle of the capital of Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel. Samaria was renamed by Herod. He called it Sebaste. And these are the towns in that area which are permitted. So anyway, bottom line on all this, we have a practical guide to the laws of the land, and this Mosaic has parallel and complementary texts in the Talmud Yerushalmi. And so together, these have been used to mutually elucidate the text in both the Mosaic and the Talmud. It should be noted that the text of the Talmud Yerushalmi we have today, right? So we've got really two major sources. Recently, it was just the Talmud gave us a source. Now we have this mosaic. And we have to note here that the Talmud Yerushalmi we have today is based on the one and only manuscript in the whole Jerusalem Talmud. And this dates from the 13th century. And where is it to be found? It's to be found in Leiden in Holland. That's where it's situated. Leiden in Holland is where this Talmud Yerushalmi is to be found. It's known as the Ketav Yad Leiden. That's what we have of the Yerushalmi today. So the importance of the Mosaic of Rehov is that it is an original manuscript. I know it's written in stone, but it's a manuscript, and it's original from the time of the completion of the time of the Talmud Yerushalmi was completed in the 4th century, and it's unspoiled. In other words, this is what was written then, and it's not being copied by scribes as the other manuscripts we have today have been copied and copied. And every time there's a copy, there's a small error here and something's missed out. This is original manuscript in stone, in mosaic, from the time of the 4th century, the time that the Jews were living in Eretz Yisrael at that time, the time they wrote the Talmud Yerushalmi, and this is was a wonderful and most interesting find. So I think time is up. I just want to conclude something quite interesting here. The mosaic of Rehov today, you can't find it anymore in its original location in the Galil, in Kibbutz Ein HaNatziv. It's not there anymore. Where's it gone? After the excavations were completed, the Israel Antiquities Authority offered to set up a museum in Kibbutz Ein HaNatziv to display this remarkable find. However, there was a condition attached, that the museum would have to be open 7 days a week, which means people would be coming on Shabbat to visit it, coming by car, tourists, buses, coaches. Kibbutz Ein HaNatziv wanted to retain the sanctity of the Sabbath, of the Shabbat, and refused the offer. The mosaic was subsequently removed to the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, where it could be found today. However, before it was moved, the members of the kibbutz made a faithful copy mosaic, which can be found today on the kibbutz. They made a copy in mosaic form in stone. And if you visit the kibbutz, you can actually go and see the mosaic, this exact copy. And those who wrote the original mosaic, which obviously was a document in halacha, would have been very proud of the member of the kibbutz for their defense of the halacha and not allowing Schmitta, not allowing the Shabbat to be broken. And of course, Schmittah is also Shabbat. Shabbat and Schmittah have got the same idea of resting. And we as Jews have to defend the Shabbat, and we have to protect it. So this wonderful find, this very interesting discovery, and the whole history of Schmitta and the location of this mosaic should give us inspiration that we also must keep the Shabbat. We must keep the Shemitah, those of living in Eretz Yisrael. This is why we've been given Eretz Yisrael, in order that we keep the mitzvot. And that's what Hashem told us. You own the land, you have to keep the laws. And that's where we are. So there we are. That's the connection of Schmitta with the geography and the borders of Eretz Yisrael. Any questions? Any comments? I'll be pleased to hear.
Comments is very nice, and I learned a lot of it.
Yes, it's a very interesting subject.
Yes, you can prepare your coffee. I'll be over in 10 minutes to discuss the further developments. You drink coffee now at Frank's home? You can come to my home as well. Yes, no problem at all. Yeah.
Lovely. Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much. was very interested. Thank you very
Thank you.
much.
Thank you so
Okay,
much.
and
That's-
pleased you enjoyed it.
Yes,
Okay. So good night, everybody. Have a
Thank
good
good
evening.
night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Very interesting. Thank you very much. Yes. And very clear.
Bye-bye. Thank you.